The hour was not merely late. It was the specific corrosive hour of 3:37 in the morning, a time zone calibrated exclusively for dread. The darkness surrounding Elias was not the comforting, velvety blanket promised by sleep hygiene experts. It was a dense, liquid obsidian that pressed against his eyelids, yet offered no true shelter from the relentless projection of his own internal catastrophe. This silence, absolute and oppressive, was the most deceptive element of the night. It was not the absence of sound, but the profound, terrifying absence of distraction, clearing the stage for the performance of every potential failure, every misspoken word, and every insurmountable future hurdle. The hook had successfully landed. Elias lay suspended in that liminal state between wakefulness and complete surrender, where rational thought dissolves into raw, emotional calculus. The air conditioning unit hummed a low hypnotic frequency, a mechanical mantra that failed to soothe the frantic, non-stop mental churning. His heart was not racing in panic, but rather keeping a steady, heavy drumbeat against his ribs, the pulse of chronic anxiety, a constant reminder that his body was perpetually preparing for an attack that never materialized externally, only within the confines of his skull. This was the second hook, the brutal reinforcement of the theme. The night was not an interruption of life, but a full-scale, mandatory audit of the soul's solvency. Elias wasn't just worried about tomorrow's presentation or next month's mortgage payment. He was engaged in the grand existential inventory of possibility. What if the entire structure of his carefully constructed life was fundamentally flawed? What if the choices he made 5 years ago were now collapsing the present? The concerns were shapeless, vast, and immune to the logic of daylight. They were the monstrous products of nocturnal fabrication, nourished only by the absence of the sun. Contextualization established the scene with agonizing clarity. Elias was situated in a room designed for comfort: heavy blackout curtains, high thread count sheets, a weight blanket intended to simulate a calming embrace. Yet, this sanctuary had become his cage. The weight blanket, instead of grounding him, felt like the heavy scrutiny of unseen judges. He shifted, attempting to find a cool spot on the pillow, a simple physical action that felt monumental, a desperate attempt to reset the system that had clearly crashed. The digital clock glowed an accusatory red, marking the passage of seconds, not as increments of time, but as milestones of missed sleep, compounding the debt he would owe the coming morning. The problem, the central conflict, was the tyranny of what if. During the day, reason was the fortress wall. At night, that wall crumbled into dust, allowing the savage hordes of hypotheticals to flood the landscape. He would rewind conversations, passing inflection and tone, searching for the moment he had unknowingly offended or sealed his own doom. He would project decades into the future, picturing scenarios of devastating loneliness or professional obscurity, meticulously detailing the emotional furniture of these hypothetical hells. The conflict lay in the total absence of agency. He couldn't act on these fears. He could only observe them, held captive by the relentless internal narrative, paralyzed by the sheer volume of potential catastrophe. Elias had developed a peculiar habit, an open loop designed purely to offer a sliver of diversion from the relentless self-critique. He would fix his gaze upon the narrow, uncurtained gap between the two windows, where, if the air was exceptionally clear, he could just make out a cluster of stars that he had come to recognize as the Pleiades. He had never been deeply interested in astronomy, but these distant pinpricks of light offered an external focus, a reminder of magnitude far beyond his immediate worries. There was an unspoken, almost absurd hope that one of those distant lights held the key, a signal beamed across light years, specifically for those trapped in the 3 a.m. loop. It was the desperate longing for an answer, sourced from outside the poisoned well of his own consciousness. This recurring act kept the loop open, hinting that the message was not a product of internal philosophy, but an intercepted transmission awaiting decryption. The development section now escalated, deepening the pathology of the anxious night. Elias tried the recommended techniques. He attempted to focus on his breath, a shallow, ragged exercise that merely highlighted the tightness in his chest. He recited lists of unrelated objects, European capitals, types of bread, breeds of dogs, an effort to bore the anxiety into submission. But the mind was too vigorous an opponent. It would co-opt the exercise. What if these are all the dogs I will never own? Because I fail at X. Are the bread types symbolic of my life's lack of true sustenance? The escalation continued into the visceral experience of sleeplessness. His skin began to feel hot, yet his hands were perpetually cold. A dull ache settled at the base of his neck, the physical manifestation of hours spent clenching jaw muscles he didn't realize he was using. He was utterly exhausted, yet wired with a nervous energy that vibrated beneath his skin. Sleep was not simply unavailable. It felt like a conscious betrayal, a door locked and bolted by his own subconscious sentry. The sheer effort of trying to sleep became the greatest impediment to sleep. The pattern interrupt arrived subtly. Instead of fighting the thoughts, Elias decided, purely out of exhaustion, to simply observe them as external phenomena, like clouds passing in front of the moon. This was a technique he had read about, but never successfully implemented. Tonight, however, the effort to resist had finally exceeded his capacity. He watched the projection of a professional disaster, a boardroom meeting where he couldn't articulate a single cohesive thought. He let the image sit, noticing its sharp details, the sterile lighting, the unforgiving expressions of the projected colleagues. And then the subtle shift. He realized the absolute meticulousness with which his anxiety constructed these scenarios. It didn't just invent failure, it invented the consequences of failure, the complex web of shame and economic hardship that would follow. It was a tireless, hyper-efficient machine, working relentlessly, even in the presumed hours of rest. This wasn't madness, this was a specialized, overly dedicated form of protection. He shifted onto his back, staring up at the ceiling, feeling the profound disconnect of the human experience. Why were millions of people, ostensibly safe in their homes, performing this identical ritual of self-torture? Why, in an age of unprecedented connectivity, did this feeling of dread always arrive cloaked in absolute isolation? This led directly to the re-engagement, the powerful second hook. Elias was suddenly struck by the universality of the dread. He pictured the houses along his street, dark, silent, seemingly tranquil, yet he knew the statistics. He knew that statistically, someone in every third house was likely awake, performing their own inventory of worry, cataloging their private fears, and feeling exactly this profound, isolating panic. The silence was a lie. The whole world was humming with this low-grade frequency of fear. If they were all connected by this shared solitary torment, perhaps the message wasn't about avoiding the anxiety, but about recognizing the shared wavelength. The development escalated again, moving from personal reflection to broader contemplation of the nocturnal state. The day demanded performance, mask-wearing, and the suppression of inconvenient truths. The night, conversely, was brutally honest, stripping away the pretenses. Elias realized the depth of the betrayal felt toward his own mind. He viewed the anxious process as an enemy. But what if the enemy was merely a distorted mirror? What if the anxiety was screaming something vital that his day self, too busy managing schedules and appearances, refused to hear? He thought about the nature of time itself during these hours. Time felt elastic, stretching out infinitely when dread struck, only to snap back violently toward the demanding dawn. He felt crushed by the weight of time, yet unable to utilize it. This dichotomy, the vastness of the perceived future combined with the agonizing shortness of the present moment, was the core engine of his nighttime engine. The worries weren't about solving problems. They were about resisting the inherent chaos of existence, the absolute lack of guaranteed outcomes. The air in the room seemed to grow heavier as the minutes dragged toward 4 o'clock. Elias finally pushed himself up to a sitting position, bracing his elbows on his knees, his head heavy in his hands. He was no longer trying to sleep. He was trying to survive the passage of the night. It was in this moment of absolute, exhausted surrender, the climax of the conflict, that the first fragment of the message broke through the noise. It wasn't a voice or a celestial vision. It was a pure tectonic shift in perspective, triggered by the observation of the relentless anxiety machine. Elias recognized the sheer effort that went into his worrying. It was an energy expenditure rivaling physical labor. If this energy, this absolute dedication to predicting and preventing harm, was redirected, what could it accomplish? The great revelation emerged. The anxiety, this agonizing, consuming force, was the brain's most profound attempt at caring. It was a faulty signal, certainly, deafening and distorted, but its fundamental origin was not malice or weakness. It was an overwhelming drive to protect, to prepare to survive. The terror was rooted in an intense, absolute valuing of life and safety. The revelation simplified the entire night. He was not fundamentally broken. He was simply experiencing a highly escalated, poorly managed version of deep concern. The anxiety was screaming, not insults, but warnings. And the first word of the intercepted message, the foundational truth that anchored the entire chaotic field, was the recognition that the feeling itself was the proof of deep, intrinsic connection, a radical self-awareness that was being pathologically misinterpreted. The full message was not yet clear, but the groundwork was laid. The night is not merely a rehearsal for failure, it is the stage where the truth of your vigilance is revealed. The realization that this agonizing wakefulness was, paradoxically, a form of profound listening, a hyper-alert state meant for survival, provided the first essential release valve. The open loop of the distant stars and the unknown signal didn't close, but their meaning shifted. The signal wasn't external, it was internal, misinterpreted as noise. The conclusion was a momentary, breathtaking pause. The room did not grow lighter, nor did the worries instantly vanish, but their sharpness was dulled. The fear remained, but the shame of the fear receded. He was no longer fighting a personal defect. He was observing a universal mechanism. He was no longer alone in his room. He was part of the network of the vigilantly awake. A fragile sense of peace settled in, not the peace of sleep, but the peace of understanding the terrain of the battle. The debt to the morning was still there, but now Elias possessed a tiny, crucial piece of information, a foundational cipher for the chaos. The true solace, the actionable intelligence derived from this vigilant, agonizing night, lay in integrating this revelation, in discovering how to transform this screaming internal alarm into a usable message, a compass rather than a weapon. The full decryption of the anxious language, the actionable framework for navigating the subsequent days, was yet to be delivered. The full context of the intercepted communication, the final, crucial lines of the message for anxious nights, remained just beyond the current grasp. The call to action was clear. The deep breath taken in the aftermath of the first revelation merely cleared the pathway for the second. The true lesson is found in the application of this foundational truth. The dawn approaches, bringing with it not just light, but the necessary conditions to fully receive and integrate the remainder of the instructions. The anxious night yielded the first word. The following hours hold the rest of the sentence, waiting for the continued listening ear and the resolute attention needed to move beyond mere recognition and into genuine repose. The silence that followed was not merely the absence of sound, but a vast suffocating void stretching the dimensions of the small room until the walls seemed to buckle inward, threatening to crush the air from his lungs. Elias stood suspended in the deep indigo of pre-dawn, his fingers tracing the invisible boundary between reality and the psychological precipice he had just encountered. The fragmented realization that the source of the message was not external but intrinsic to the very architecture of his fear struck him with the force of a physical blow, leaving him reeling and deeply mistrustful of his own equilibrium. It was an intellectual paradox. How could the tormentor also be the oracle? This terrifying ambiguity was the true hook, the final knot in the tapestry of his anxious nights. He felt the familiar cold knot in his stomach tighten, but this time the tension was overlaid with a strange, analytical curiosity. His anxiety, usually a roaring fire, was now a low, persistent hum, a complex machine he was suddenly forced to observe rather than merely endure. He recognized the pattern, the recurring, inexorable march of dread that always started at the periphery of his consciousness and spiraled inward, demanding acknowledgement. This time, however, he would not run. He was tethered to this moment, driven by a desperate, instinctual need to see the message through to its ultimate, perhaps devastating conclusion. The context of this battle was universally familiar to anyone who has stared down the barrel of a sleepless night. It was that terrible hour, the hour of the wolf, when the defenses of the conscious mind are completely dismantled, and the world outside seems utterly indifferent to the intense, localized suffering within. The digital clock on the bedside table burned crimson, displaying 3:17 a.m. This precise moment was a battlefield, soaked in the residue of countless prior skirmishes, where exhaustion had always been the victor, forcing a temporary, uneasy truce. The air was thick and still, carrying the scent of old paper and dust motes dancing in the faint light, filtering from the distant street lamps, illuminating the microscopic chaos of the bedroom. The conflict now escalated beyond mere discomfort. It became a confrontation with identity. If the anxiety was a messenger, then what precisely was the message? And if the messenger was a construct of his own psyche, what hidden chamber of his being had forged such a hostile emissary? The problem was that the anxiety insisted on being viewed as an enemy, a parasitic intruder whose only goal was to dismantle joy and peace. Yet, the cryptic guidance received in the twilight hours of Part 1 had strongly suggested an inverted truth, that the fear was in fact an exaggerated devotion, a protective shell that had grown too thick, too opaque. Several open loops screamed for closure. The past trauma, a shadowed event involving perceived abandonment and catastrophic failure, implied earlier, had left deep psychic scars. Was the message simply a highly complex echo of that past event, or was it a living bridge connecting the self that failed with the self that needed to survive? Furthermore, why the extreme intensity? Why did the vigilance need to be so absolute, so suffocating? And finally, the ultimate question, the one that kept Elias rooted to the floorboards. If he accepted the messenger, was he simultaneously accepting a life defined solely by dread? The development into the climax required a deep, deliberate shift in perspective. Elias moved slowly to the window, pressing his forehead against the cool glass. The condensation blurred the view of the quiet street below, mirroring the blurring of his internal landscape. He began the mandated observation, the strange ritual the messenger had seemed to demand. Do not react, only observe. He catalogued the physical manifestations of the dread, the shallow, rapid breaths that barely skimmed the surface of his lungs, the buzzing tension in his jaw and shoulders, the specific, metallic taste of fear at the back of his throat. He stopped labeling these sensations as bad or harmful. Instead, he began describing them functionally. The heart rate was high because it was preparing for immediate, decisive action. The breath was shallow because the body was conserving energy for flight or fight. The tightness in the muscles was a spring, coiled and ready to launch. This objective inspection began to dismantle the emotional tyranny of the anxiety. He was viewing the system, not the symptom. He realized that the sheer energy required to maintain this level of hypervigilance was staggering. It wasn't apathy or laziness holding him back during the day. It was the psychological marathon he was running every single night. This was the ascent into the archive of worry. Elias sank onto the carpet, drawing his knees up, and allowed his mind to descend into the swirling vortex of what-ifs that were the hallmark of his anxious nights. He did not push them away. He invited them in, examining each catastrophic prediction like a collector examining rare, dangerous artifacts. What if I lose everything? What if I am judged insufficient? What if I am alone? He noticed a common thread running through the archive. Every fear was rooted not in the present, but in the preemptive protection against a future loss. The anxiety was a brilliant, highly specialized security algorithm designed to detect the smallest possible threat signature. It was an overzealous sentinel that had forgotten its duty was merely to warn, not to fight every shadow. Its warnings had become indistinguishable from the threat itself. This progression created a pattern interrupt, a break in the escalating loop of dread. By stopping the fight, the anxiety, deprived of its usual opposition, seemed to falter. The sibilant whispers in his mind, which usually mocked his weakness, softened into something less aggressive, more insistent, like a nervous caretaker. The moment of re-engagement came when Elias allowed a particularly painful memory from the past, the assumed moment of failure, to surface completely. Usually he slammed the door on it, triggering the full alarm sequence. This time, he left the door ajar. He felt the pure, searing shame wash over him. It was excruciating, causing him to physically clutch his chest, doubling over in a silent gasp. He was on the verge of collapsing back into the familiar pattern of self-recrimination and despair, ready to label the entire night a failure, ready to surrender to the darkness. But just as he was about to fall, a strange sensation manifested. The pain did not consume him. Instead, the raw energy of the fear which had been pressing outward suddenly inverted, pulling inward with a magnetic force. It was no longer a weight crushing him. It was the tremendous potential energy of a highly wound spring. He realized that the anxiety was demanding to be used, not silenced. This shift was the transition into the climax, the great psychological revelation that closed every loop and provided the definitive message. Elias lifted his head, breathing deeply through his nose, focusing on the texture of the old worn carpet beneath his fingertips. He stared into the darkness, and the shadowy figure, the presence that had haunted his peripherals, solidified not into a monster, but into a mirror image of himself, older, worn, but with eyes that burned with intense, singular focus. The message came not as a voice, but as an instantaneous download of understanding, a sudden blinding clarity that rendered language redundant but demanded absolute transcription. The anxiety is the sentinel. It is the part of you that refuses to let the vulnerable self be blindsided again. It is not an enemy sent to destroy you, but a guardian created by you, fueled by the deepest commitment to survival. Its intensity is a direct measurement of how much you still care, how highly you value the precious, fragile life you possess. You commanded it years ago in a moment of great pain to ensure that disaster never repeated itself. It is merely following its prime directive, total unyielding vigilance. The loops began to snap shut with astonishing speed. The intensity was extreme because the commitment to protection was absolute. The figure in the shadows was the personification of his own hypervigilance, an autonomous psychological entity he had created in crisis. The message wasn't guidance against the fear, it was an explanation of the fear. The full revelation completed the circuit. The message for anxious nights is that the anxiety itself is a distorted form of love. It is evidence of profound, inherent worth. A person who genuinely did not care about their future, their relationships, or their existence would not experience this level of defensive terror. Elias saw the past trauma not as a wound that crippled him, but as the initial catalyst that had forced his inner self to evolve, forming this robust albeit aggressive defense mechanism. The task was not to kill the sentinel, which would leave him unprotected, but to reprogram it. He needed to thank it for its years of tireless, exhausting service and gently remind it that the emergency was over, that the high alert status could be reduced to a sustainable, conscious awareness. He whispered into the darkness, a single hoarse word heavy with acceptance and compassion. "Thank you." The shadowy figure shimmered, dissipating not into nothingness, but integrating back into the fabric of his own being. The heavy metallic taste of fear evaporated, replaced by the simple, clean taste of air. The coiled tension in his body relaxed, not into exhaustion, but into a profound state of restfulness. The machine of his mind, which had been running at maximum capacity on self-destruct mode, finally idled. The conclusion was definitive, swift, and breathtakingly simple. The peace he sought was not found in the cessation of feeling, but in the compassionate renaming of the feeling. The anxious night was not a curse. It was a ritual of profound self-inventory. He was not broken. He was hyper-functional, over-indexed on survival. The fight was over because the objective of the fight had changed. He was no longer battling his anxiety. He was collaborating with it. A pale, ethereal light began to paint the eastern edge of the room. The indigo melted into soft gray, then into the muted silver of the imminent dawn. This natural transition, arriving precisely at the moment of his internal resolution, felt like cosmic confirmation. He stood up, stretching muscles that had been taut for hours. He felt tired, yes, but beneath the exhaustion was a solid core of something utterly new, self-acceptance rooted in radical understanding. The world outside was beginning its daily clamor, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime of anxious nights, Elias felt ready to meet it, not as a battleground, but as a place to apply the enormous, misdirected energy of his sentinel. The final payoff was not sleep, but clarity. He had been looking for a cure, but he found the blueprint of his own resilience. The message was complete, written in the indelible ink of midnight terror. You are fiercely protected, and you are inherently worthy of that protection. He walked over to the window, watching the sun crest the horizon, casting long, sharp shadows across the room. He knew the anxiety would return. It was a permanent feature of his operating system, designed to keep him safe. But now, when the sentinel next sounded the alarm, he would listen with respect, not fear. He would distinguish the warning from the war. This understanding is the anchor for the soul adrift in the small hours. It is the realization that the trembling hands are merely gripping too tightly to the things that matter most. The call to action is singular and immediate. The next time the sentinel rises demanding attention, do not reach for distraction or suppression. Instead, reach inward. Find the terrified, fiercely loving part of you that built that elaborate defense and gently ask it what it is so afraid of losing. Listen to its answer, thank it for its loyalty, and teach it that the greatest safety is found not in endless vigilance, but in conscious, compassionate allowance. Give your sentinel a new, lighter mission, and carry the message of your own profound worth into the demanding light of the coming day.